Good afternoon. Welcome to our seminar series. We have a sellout crowd today. I'm glad that everybody should... The cookies are all gone, yes, you can tell, you know. And it's a great pleasure to introduce today Steve Grossberg to give our presentation, our colloquium speaker today. Steve is a professor of cognitive and neural systems and professor of mathematics, psychology, and biomedical engineering at Boston University. He's the founder of the Department of Cognitive and Neural Systems at BU, and also the founder and director of the Center for Adaptive Excellence in Learning and Education, CELEST, in short. He's the founder of and president of the first president of the International Neural Network Society, and many other accomplishments. He's a 2003 INNS Helmholtz Award and a fellow of the American Psychological Association and the Society of Experimental Psychologists, also an IEEE fellow. So he's really he has a very broad spectrum of contributions, both in scientific and engineering field. In fact, I'm reading from the Wikipedia, so if you really want to learn more about Steve, go and just Google him on Wikipedia. I've known Steve personally. We had two Muris together on Vision and with Boston University, and we had a lot of fun, you know, over the periods of those years. So, without any more delays, Steve, please.
No. Am I on? Oh, I think I'm on now. Thank you. Well, it's very nice to be here. Thank you for coming. In order to point and advance my slides, I have to do a little shuffle here. My topic today is ambitious. It's cortical dynamics of attentive object recognition, scene understanding, and decision making. Each of these topics we could talk about for years, but I just wanted to introduce you to some new ideas that have come up that we found very helpful. And if you are interested in some of them, a lot of papers are on my webpage if you just Google me. So why don't we just jump in? Let's just start talking about attentive object recognition. I have to get used to this twisted posture. And here let's raise some basic questions right off. What is an object? How does the brain learn what an object is under both unsupervised and supervised conditions? How does the brain intelligently scan a scene with eye movements? In particular, why don't the eyes jump around randomly? And this famous picture from Yarbus shows, and looking at Nefertiti, you certainly don't. How does the brain learn to bind multiple views of an object into an emerging view-invariant object category while scanning its salient parts with these eye movements? So this work builds on some breakthroughs in brain computing, and some of you may already know that there are more and more models that link brain circuits to the adaptive behaviors they control. And this isn't just a question of incremental improvements. They're really new paradigms for computation that really totally violate any notion of independent modules. And two of these paradigms I like to call complementary computing and laminar computing, where complementary computing speaks to what is the nature of brain specialization, and laminar computing talks to why are all neocortical circuits organized in layers. So let's just look at complementary computing a little bit. So complementary computing, I believe, gives us new principles of uncertainty and complementarity that clarify why there are multiple parallel processing streams in the brain. For example, this famous picture of Van Essen and his colleagues, why we have multiple stages of processing and why there are interactions between processing streams. So you might ask, what are complementary properties? Well, there are analogies, like a lock fitting into a key or puzzle pieces fitting together. This is weird. There should be another puzzle piece here. It's never vanished before. Oh well, looking forward to other surprises. In particular, computing one set of properties at a processing stage prevents that stage from computing a complementary set of properties. And these complementary parallel processing streams are balanced against one another, and it's interactions between the streams that overcome their complementary weaknesses and support intelligent behavior. And I'll be giving you examples, of course. The reason I mention it is that over the years there are emerging models and lots of data supporting the idea that there are lots of pairs of complementary processes. For example, in terms of the claim that visual motion is complementary, visual boundaries are complementary to visual motion, just this year, one of the predictions I made quite a while ago got its strongest supportive data. The prediction was that 3D form groupings and motion groupings are complementary. I made the prediction in 1991, and just last year in Nature Neuroscience, Pons-Lomber and Bourne had a beautiful experiment that gave the strongest support so far. And here the question is, why are there separate cortical form and motion streams? Like you have a stream from V1 to V2 to V4, you have another stream starting in V1 going from V1 to MT to MST. And given that V1 is already processing some aspects of form and motion, why has the brain gone to the trouble of creating so much hardware, if you like, with these processing streams? Well, one of the things that the form stream does is based on precise orientational computations, namely trying to get 3D representations of the world from binocular disparity. And in fact, Mondeheit here has some beautiful data on that. And models of this indicated how you could generate 3D boundaries which had fine depth discrimination, but in doing that, they could only give you coarse directional discrimination. On the other hand, if you want to have good motion direction, let's say you have an object moving diagonally to the right, here it's very important to pool over multiple orientations going in the same direction. But if you pool over all these orientations to get good direction, you lose the very fine matching for binocular disparity that you need to get fine depth. So here the model showed how, like within this stream, you could get fine direction at the expense of coarse depth. But the prediction was that there are interactions between V2 and MT that achieves fine moving form in depth, okay, so that these 3D boundaries are selecting motion signals at the corresponding depth to help with object tracking. Well, what Ponce et al. Did was they cooled V2, and they studied the effect on MT, and they unmasked these properties. Okay. So that's still a story going on, but it illustrates what I mean. And this is part of the development over many years of what I like to call the 3D for motion model. And here we have in the model how V2 and MT interact. And there are other processing stages that you have to worry about. Well, the claim is also that a lot of things going on in the Watt stream during perception recognition are complementary to what's going on in the Ware stream for spatial representation and action. And so we're talking about, you know, these very large streams in the brain, the dorsal stream and the ventral stream. The claim is a lot of their processing is complementary. And one aspect of that I'll be focusing on today is how in the Watt stream you get increasingly spatially invariant object recognition, whereas in the Ware stream you need spatially variant action. And I should say in our center, Celeste, we're working collaboratively to develop a large-scale model where at each stage we have very detailed models of processing from retina through prefrontal cortex. And we believe these interactions reflect a lot of different kinds of complementary processing. Well, I need to show you a very old example of complementarity, the claim that visual boundaries are complementary to visual surfaces. Well, first, what is a visual boundary or grouping? Well, it could be an illusory contour. It could be texture pop-out. It could be 3D shape from shading. Many of you, I hope, perceive a smooth 3D form, although it's a discrete 2D set of patches, which is both philosophically and scientifically interesting. and figure ground separation. So these are all examples of visual boundaries. Well, the question is, how are perceptual surfaces formed? And the claim is through interactions with these perceptual boundaries or groupings. And the claim is that boundaries are computed in the so-called interblob stream from V1 to V4, and surfaces are computing in the blob stream. And if you know the work of Livingstone and Hubel, that's not what their claim is. We could come to that if you're interested. Well, here's an example, briefly put, of what I mean when I say visual boundaries and surfaces are complementary. I hope many of you can see the blue color in there. Can you see it? Okay, otherwise, you know, I'm in trouble. So that's called neon color spreading. And let's just look at two properties here. In terms of boundary completion, you're forming an illusory square around here, okay? And that's oriented. It's oriented between pairs or greater numbers of inducers. You're not forming boundaries every which way or you'd go nuts. And it's inward. It's inward between pairs or greater numbers of inducers. On the other hand, look at the spread of the color. It's coming out of these corners between the black and the blue. It's unoriented. It's spreading every which way. It's spreading outwardly between, outward from individual inducers. So if you look at boundary completion versus surface filling in, oriented, unoriented, inward, outward, that illustrates these complementary properties. You can't be outward and inward. You can't be oriented and unoriented. And they have to interact to give you the percept. So this immediately leads to the question, how do complementary boundaries and surfaces give rise to a consistent percept? In other words, we only see that one thing, and our models have proposed predictions of inner stream interactions, just like that V2 to MT interaction. And the claim is that this process clarifies how figure ground separation occurs and also how eye movement search occurs. And I want to tell you enough about this today to make some new points. The idea is that an active shroud inhibits reset of an emerging view-invariant object category as it's associated with multiple learned view categories of that surface that are being reset as the eyes move. So the point is, I'm categorizing this view, then a pretty different view. I categorize that. To categorize that, I shut that off. To categorize that, I shut that off. I don't want to shut that off, because if I shut that off, then it couldn't become view invariant. I need to associate all these different view categories with that emerging thing. Moreover, each view category, as we'll see, is using object attention to stabilize its learning. So the general claim is how spatial attention coordinates how object attention is deployed during view-invariant object category learning. That's what I want to tell you more about. So first, what's an attentional shroud? Well, the claim is it's surface-fitting spatial attention, namely an attentional shroud, like in this Magritte, if you like, marks the objecthood of the as-yet undefined object category. In fact, Christopher Tyler and Kontsevich use shrouds to study perceptual transparency, and many other people have talked about how spatial attention is organized, including Steve Yantis here at Hopkins. Our prediction is that shrouds enable learning of view-invariant object categories. And this paper with my colleagues just appeared in Cognitive Psychology, so that should be 2009. If you're interested, it's on my webpage. So let me clarify this. So we're going to be talking about, in the Watt stream, aspects of perception, categorization, and complementary processes in the Ware stream of how this interacts to control eye movements. And it's these places now in yellow that we're going to be studying and how they work together. And in fact, this is the so-called ARTSCAN model, just schematized in terms of parts of the brain that we feel are involved. There are a lot of cortical areas that we've been forced to integrate here, and some of them, like LIP and V3A, can't fit in that other picture, so representing these is hard, and I'm not going to be able to go through all the detailed ideas here, but I want to give you the main points. So one of them is, how do you do bottom-up spatial attentional competition? So let's say I'm looking at a cross-section here. You know, you've just had one from Craig-O'Brien-Cornsweet. You know, two luminous regions. Let's say this is a little more luminous. They start going up to the spatial attention region, bidding for spatial attention, and there's a lot of competition between them. But there's also top-down feedback, turning this into a recurrent on-center, off-surround competitive net, okay? And that competition can make this region win and can also enhance the contrast here, as has been reported. So this would now be a selection of a shroud through a surface shroud resonance. So you get started pre-attentively, but then you confirm it with spatial attention. Well, you can also start with a top-down spotlight of attention. In fact, there's a big theme here: how do attentional spotlights work together with form-fitting attention? So let's say I just happen to hit a spotlight of attention here. That goes down to the surface filling in domain. You already saw it with Craig-O'Brien-Cornsweet. So that attention spreads here. Now you go back up and you close the loop again, and now you convert the spotlight of attention into a spatial attentional shroud and down-regulate the other shroud. Okay. And so the prediction is that an active shroud maintains activity of a view-invariant object category, so that while this resonance is going on, I can be looking at the object. I create one view category, I reset, I create another, I reset, I create another, I reset it. But I got to keep the view-invariant one from getting reset. And the claim is that that's being actively prevented. Okay? Now, if that shroud collapses, there's going to be a burst which is going to shut this down and let you start all over. And I had a really exciting talk with Steve Yantis today, because I'm hoping that some of his data in parietal cortex is about this process, but we'll see. Well, that raises the question, how are view categories learned? And here we need to get to some old work of mine, which I'm going to review in the briefest possible way, just to make one point. And that has to do with adaptive resonance theory, or ART, which I introduced over 30 years ago, to try to clarify what I like to call the stability-plasticity dilemma. So this is the question: how can learning continue into adulthood without causing catastrophic forgetting? Or how can we learn quickly without being forced to forget just as quickly? So, you know, I'm looking at a lot of faces here. I've learned each of them in a second. I have no fear that when I go home I'll have forgotten half my friends. That's catastrophic forgetting, and it is an accomplishment. And so ART helps to solve the old problem of how do we pay attention and learn expectations. It's all about top-down processing. A lot of people have studied it with different names, but in ART the main idea is that top-down attentive feedback encodes learned expectations that self-stabilize learning by an active matching process in response to an arbitrary, non-stationary world. And where adaptive resonance comes into it is attended feature clusters in green reactivate bottom-up pathways, and the activated categories or compressed representations reactivate their top-down pathways, and this closes a loop which leads to a resonant state that synchronizes, amplifies, and prolongs the responses of the cells in the resonance. And it's because of these properties that the resonance can trigger fast learning in the bottom-up and top-down filters. That's why I call it adaptive resonance. And in this way, it prevents outliers from catastrophically causing you to forget. And I could go give you a whole talk on this, but I'm proud to be able to say that all the key ART predictions have behavioral and neurobiological support now. One kind of meta prediction is that all conscious states are resonant states, but not necessarily conversely. And there's even growing neurophysiological support during the past several years of a connection predicted between consciousness, learning, expectation, attention, resonance, and synchrony. I'm not saying that consciousness equals learning. One has to study the connection, but there are lots of labs that have shown combinations of these things and how they're working together. What I want to focus on, just one more point today, is how do we balance between expected and unexpected events? How do we incorporate truly novel events into the corpus of what we already know without catastrophic forgetting? And this requires, again, an interaction between complementary systems. So, for example, I said that boundaries and surfaces are complementary. I claimed that this attentional system and this orienting system are complementary, and the attentional system involving regions like temporal and prefrontal cortex, whereas the orienting system involves regions of the brain like the hippocampus and nonspecific thalamus. So we're talking about very large-scale kinds of interactions across the brain. So the attentional system is there to learn about expected events until they become familiar. Here you have words like resonance, attention, learning, and recognition. The orienting system is trying to deal with truly novel or unexpected or unfamiliar events. Here the words are words like reset, memory search, and hypothesis testing to discover how to incorporate new representations or refined representations into the corpus of the familiar without catastrophic forgetting. And this is a very general problem that, at least half the people I talk to today are working on in one form or another. And so this is just a schematic of the simplest ART algorithm. It's called ART1. It was developed with my colleague Gail Carpenter, where on the one hand you have an attentional system, and then it's interacting with this orienting or reset system. And let me just tell you one more fact here, and then use it for our goal today. And that's how ART hypothesis testing and learning occur. So first, let's suppose that we have some distributed representation of features here. I'll only show you one arrow, but think of just a vector or pattern coming in and turning on some features more than others. Each of these active pathways is going to try to turn on the orienting system, but you don't want it always to be on, especially in the bottom-up mode, and you'll see that there's a dynamic balance between the number of active pathways and the number of active features that can inhibit the orienting system as this pattern goes through the adaptive filter and tries to choose a compressed representation or category. That now is going to try to read out using the ART matching rule, which is going to try to select the features that are compatible with the hypothesis and suppress the rest. And if there's too big a mismatch, then there's going to be a huge loss of activation here, and you're going to have a reduction of inhibition here, which means that there might be more excitation than inhibition, and you can fire the orienting system. That's like saying, this is too novel for me, I'm going to get an orienting burst. The orienting system will send a nonspecific burst of arousal here. It'll shut off this category hypothesis. That will shut off the top-down expectation. That will go back to go, but it's conditionalized on the fact that this will stay shut off for a while as a kind of medium-term memory. And then you go up through the filter again, but now you have a field that's conditionalized on the disconfirmation of that hypothesis, and this goes on. And so the claim is that there's a dynamic cycle of resonance and reset, and that as objects are learned, the search automatically disengages, and you have direct access to the globally best matching categories. So there's nothing like linear polynomial search. You go in one pass to the best match. Okay. And this sort of clarifies how you can recognize familiar objects even as you get older and learn a lot of other stuff. So, I hope I know a lot more now at my advanced age than I did when I was 3. And when I see my mother, it doesn't take me polynomial time to say, hi, Mom. Okay. Okay, but why did I tell you this? ART view categories get reset when the object view changes sufficiently. Okay, that's what the orienting system does. But if they're getting reset, then we need to protect the view-invariant categories from reset at these times. That's the whole lesson for today. So I jumped over a lot of stuff just to say, to get this to learn at all, you need this active matching and reset. Okay. And you might say, well, why should you believe it? Well, there's a lot of data supporting it. So first there's data from event-related potentials for mismatch-mediated reset. And So my colleague Jean-Paul Banquet in Anserve in Paris did some experiments where to test the prediction of correlated sequences of ERPs, which turned out to be P120, N200, and P300. So the idea is that if you get a mismatch, that's going to trigger activation of the orienting system, which is going to trigger reset of the category, P120, N200, P300. Okay, so you can keep testing that and see if it fails. But let me just tell you today about microcircuits for resonance and reset. So my student Max Versace and I just recently published a paper in Brain Research on the so-called synchronous matching ART model. So at any point the model could collapse, or it can be a foundation for refinement and greater explanatory power. So far it's been the latter, but you never know. So here the main questions are, how are multiple levels of brain organization, spikes, local field potentials, interareal synchronous oscillations, spike timing dependent plasticity, how are they coordinated to regulate stable category learning and attention during cognitive information processing via lamina cortical circuits, this whole lamina computing issue, as they interact with specific and non-specific thalamic nuclei. So this is going in great detail down to the spiking level and down to the lamina cortical level. Now, I could spend the entire talk today trying to explain all the things that this can do for us, but so these are lamina cortical models interacting with first and higher level specific and non-specific thalamic nuclei, and it tries to rationalize and computationally specify fine details like, why do layer 5 cells give you driving inputs into the pulvinar? Why does the non-specific thalamus broadcast signals to layer 1, which can then, through retrograde spikes through dendritic interactions from layer 1 to layer 5 cells, then go to layer 6 and layer 4? What is this whole circuit for? So there are many questions here. So the point I want to make is there's a ton of anatomical data from multiple studies that now have very precise predictions, all of which can be disconfirmed. And I just want to tell you one thing that opened our eyes a little bit and speaks to this issue. So there are brain oscillations going on in the brain, and everyone's really into that now. And so what we showed, partly to our surprise, is that they depend on whether you have a top-down match or a top-down mismatch. So in a good enough match state, so if you're not triggering an orienting burst, we showed that you're going to get fast gamma oscillations. So this is like you're paying attention to something that's resonating in this bottom-up, top-down loop. The match state can trigger gamma, which is in the temporal domain of spike timing dependent learning. But if you get a mismatch, that's going to increase slow beta oscillations. And that's outside the range of spike timing dependent plasticity. So this is showing how match-mismatch, through the extra degree of freedom of temporal correlation, can either support learning or inhibit learning. Well, is there any evidence for this gamma-beta story? We were surprised by the beta. We weren't looking at it. Let me tell you one more fact and tell you what the evidence is so far. So I had mentioned before that with the nonspecific thalamic nucleus, if there's a mismatch, and you can associate this activation like with the mismatch negativity of ventral potential, this is going to broadcast signals to layer 1, go through layer 5 to 6 to 4. But what I didn't tell you is that it's designed so when that burst occurs, this is like the arousal burst in the ART search cycle, that causes a reset in the deep layers. Okay, that was the prediction of the model. And we supported this with a lot of detailed simulations like what's going on these dendrites. There's beautiful data about that stuff. But that's why I was really excited when Bob Desimone, and I still haven't seen the publication, but he reported this at our department a year or two ago, that if they do time averaging in visual cortex they found different average oscillation frequencies at the superficial and deep cortical layers. And they found at the deep layers the beta that we were expecting, and in the superficial layers the gamma. Bob said he didn't know what it meant, so we predicted that if you have more mismatches per unit time, you'll increase the beta to gamma ratio. So we'll see. Maybe it won't work out, but it can be tested. But there are 2 more labs now that have shown this sort of thing. For example, Earl Miller, who's a colleague of mine, heard about our work, and he had just done experiments where he had monkeys shifting spatial attention to different locations. And he figured at the reset moment, the moment where you shift attention, if this is a general thing, he should look for beta. And so he realigned his data, and he found the beta where it should have been. And Josh Burke in University of Michigan has done studies of hippocampal place cell learning, and he finds beta oscillations just where you'd expect mismatches. So it may very well be that this is really going on. But this indicates to you that this match-mismatch story hasn't collapsed. Far from it. It's really leading to highly non-intuitive predictions. Okay, so if you now ask what kind of attention occurs during a view category match, you know, you'd be very tempted to say object attention. But we found that it's really confusing if you don't parse that a little more finely, because there are at least 3 kinds of attention that people often call object attention. One is a kind of boundary-mediated attention that I'm not talking about today, but if you know the beautiful work of Rolfsum et al. In the Netherlands, then you'll know what I mean. The other is a surface-mediated attention, and that's the shroud-like stuff. But the third is prototype-mediated attention, which is what Art is talking about. Okay, so I'm talking about prototype-mediated attention. You're talking about the reset of the kind of attention that focuses on critical feature patterns of an object, a what object category. And it's in that sense that I mean that spatial attention coordinates how object attention is deployed during view-invariant object category learning. Okay, well, let me talk a little bit about the question, how do we know where to look next? In particular, why don't our eyes jump around randomly? I mean, why don't they? So how does the brain know how to scan salient features of objects? And I'm not just talking about a light flashing in the periphery. And I'm not talking about a pixel-defined object. I'm talking about an extended object. And how do these scanning movements occur within an object even before an object category is defined? So how do you look at what's interesting within an object before you know what an object is? So I would claim that movement targets must be selected after surfaces get separated from each other by a figure ground separation. Because if you haven't separated them, then you really don't have enough information to know whether you're looking at the same thing or not. And so what I find really intriguing is that these processes are all linked through feedback loops, if we're right. So this gets back to this question I asked earlier. I indicated that boundaries and surfaces are complementary, and how is a consistent percept created? And I believe that one main mechanism is to compare what I talked about, the formotion interaction, V2 to MT feedback. Here the prediction is, as illustrated here, feedback between V2 boundary and surfaces ensures perceptual consistency. And this goes way back. It's still developing, and I think it's consistent with the data I know. The claim is, and this is what I find the interesting thing, that the process of assuring consistency triggers figure ground separation, and I'd like to claim control scanning eye movements. So let me just spend a moment on indicating what sort of feedback. So I'm going to lightly touch these things just so you get an idea. So I showed you the Craig-O'Brien-Cornsweet thing to make a point, which was that closed boundaries surround visible regions in 3D percepts. And if you remove the boundary, stuff just flows around. So that before filling in, if I have a boundary in blue, and then I discount the illuminant, which I couldn't tell you about, which would give me an illuminant discounted surface contour input. Then filling in would occur, and it would fill in the closed contour, and you'd be great. But if I had a big gap here, all that stuff would just flow out, and I would lose the ability to see that. Okay, just like the way you saw it with your own eyes, if you could see anything today with Craig-O'Brien-Korn-Sweet. So that's why I told you about Craig-O'Brien-Korn-Sweet. So the question then is, how are closed boundaries formed? For example, if you study 3D vision and binocular disparity processing, for example, I might have a vertical boundary that has a good disparity at depth 1. And maybe that's the only boundary in the whole scene. Let's say it's Da Vinci stereopsis. Let's say all the other boundaries are viewed monocularly. Let's say this is monocularly, or they're horizontal and don't have clear disparities. Well, how does the brain put these two kinds of information together? Well, the prediction is that monocular boundaries are added to all binocular boundaries because they don't know where the hell they should go, so they go everywhere. And so you add these to all these depths, and at this depth it happens to close the boundary, so it contains its filling in. And at this depth it doesn't, and so it all flows out. So there's a big issue in vision. There are just too many boundary fragments, and you got to be able to sort of parse them. You got to get rid of the bad guys, okay? So that regions that are surrounded by a closed boundary can depth selectively contain filling in of lightness and color signals. So that now, because of this hook, I can fill in this surface at that depth. And despite the fact I project all the monocular ones everywhere, I don't have to worry about the other depths. Unfortunately, I have all these extra boundaries because I didn't have that information. Well, why am I bothering to tell you this? Because it's helped to explain a ton of other data that no one else, to the best of my knowledge, can explain. And there's a direct experimental test of this prediction by Arashi Azdanbach and Takuya Watanabe, which confirmed the predicted asymmetric interaction of horizontal boundaries and depth selective vertical boundaries. So as weird as it sounds, you might have to believe it, okay? Okay, so then how do we depth selectively detect the closed region? So here I started with this, but now after I fill that in, the claim is that the output from here is controlled by a contrast and polarity sensitive on-center off-surround network. So this network is just looking everywhere, and here there's a big difference, okay, between filled in here and here. You get a very strong contour here, a surface contour. But here, because it all spreads around, you don't get one, okay? So this is contrast and polarity sensitive on-center off-surround network that's generating outputs from closed surface contours to the corresponding boundaries. Why does it do that? Because it's saying you're a good boundary, you're a bad boundary, all using local computation. So the intuitive idea here is that previously I had all these extra boundaries, okay, but now with my feedback, this is my V2 to V2 feedback, these surface contours are going back to the boundaries that generated them. There's just a reciprocal feedback, very local, very easy, strengthening them and then saying, you're a good boundary. And at the same positions and other depths, they're saying, you're a bad boundary. You prune up all the boundaries. These are the only perceptually relevant boundaries, and these can go to object recognition. Okay? And you might say, why do I believe this? Well, it explains a ton of data. Like, why do brighter Knizia squares look closer? Weird stuff like that. Okay, but here's the kicker. I believe, but you can prove me wrong, that surface to boundary feedback also helps to control eye movement target selection. So the claim is that at the earliest stage where you can get figure ground separation, which is necessary to tell the difference between two things, you're already computing signals sufficient to make the eyes look at different views of those things. So why do I say that? Well, here I have my surface shroud resonance. I've enhanced this object surface, and I've created enhanced surface contours here to strengthen these boundaries and say, good boundary, good surface. But if you think about surface contours and the fact that they're constructed by competitive dynamics, they're going to be enhanced where they have curvature differences, where they have corners. They get enhanced at the kind of features people tend to look at. So the prediction is that this surface contour is not only saying good boundary, it's also saying, look here. Okay. Well, I should make a point here that this picture, for better or worse, it's certainly not the whole story, begins to unify spatial and object attention, figure ground separation, object category learning, eye movements, and visual search. I mean, so it helps you to start thinking about these things in an integrated way. And I think it may be happening in V3A, but, you know, you can prove me wrong. V3A for me is an acquired taste. So this shows, you know, as you can compute surface contours. This got washed out. I'm sorry, it's a disaster. Anyway, you can explain a lot of kinds of data this way. The classical kind of data are experiments on the reaction time costs of intra versus inter-object attentional shifts, and a very famous paper by Egli, Driver, and Raphael, where what they basically show that, you know, if you have no shift of attention or a shift of attention on the same object, you have a lower reaction time than if you have to go outside the object or to a different object. So this is the kind of data pattern you get in reaction times. This is the kind of emergent property of the circuit. And I should emphasize it's now opened the gates for us to explain a ton of other data about spatial attention and object category learning. I should also mention that it gives us, you know, pretty good benchmarks on trying to learn various databases. Okay, so let me summarize, and then I'll spend my last 15 minutes just sketching a couple of main points. So here's the conceptual summary. That bottom-up pre-attentive surface inputs to a spatial attention region or a top-down attentional spotlight can induce surface-fitting attentional shroud. A surface shroud resonance can keep a shroud active until inhibition of return, habituation, or competition from other shrouds cause the active shroud to collapse. Okay? The surface shroud resonance keeps an active object category, that is to say a view-invariant category, from resetting when individual view categories get reset, thereby allowing the object category to be associated with multiple object views. Learning of individual view categories uses object attention, specifically prototype attention, to ensure stable learning and memory. And finally, an active shroud strengthens its surface, which strengthens the corresponding boundaries via these surface contour feedback signals, which helps to select saccadic targets on the surface of the active shroud, and therefore assures intelligent object scanning while the object view and view-invariant categories are learned. So in other words, it helps you look around the object, learning view categories corresponding to it while the view-invariant thing is on, you know. And at least now we have these specific circuits with testable predictions to think about all these things at once, which I know for me has been very liberating. Let's see, I pushed that. Let me push it harder. So now I want to switch to scene understanding. Again, enormous topic. I have a few minutes. All I want to say is that shrouds are helping us to do better with scene understanding. That's my main point. So, you know, if you ask how do humans recognize a scene, you know, there's all this story about forest before trees, from global to local. There are at least two core questions. How to rapidly form a hypothesis about global scene identity, i.e. gist. And how do you revise this hypothesis by focusing attention on salient but smaller scale scenic features and textures? And we found that using texture-fitting attentional shrouds has really been useful. So the main idea to predict scene type so far in what I'm going to tell you today is you recognize texture categories on multiple scales and just to define the gist of a scene. So I hope all you know what it is. You glance at a scene and you say, I'm in the woods, you know. That's just a large-scale texture category. Now, why bother to tell you this? At least when we finished the work a year or so ago, the best accuracy that we got is 91.85% on databases that reduce the error rate of all the models we knew about by 16.5%. So it is a little better, and it's incredibly simple. So all we're saying is that you're sort of paying attention from large to small shrouds, where the gist is the whole scene. And if you have just a few principal textures and you categorize them, in particular by an art system, and then they vote, you can do better than all the other models we saw. Okay? And this is the kind of database we use. It's a really nice database of Oliver and Torralba that a lot of people use, coast, forest, mountain, countryside. And we do pre-processing. But the main thing is, like, gist for us is a large-scale boundary and surface texture. And how we compute it, that's technical. I'm sure someone could do it better. And then we just classify it with an art classifier to form a texture category, a large-scale texture category. And then where these spatial attention shifts come in, if you just think about the probability of hitting a location here, the bigger the texture, the more probable you'll hit it. In scenes like this, in fact, in their whole database, 92.7% of the area is usually covered by 3 principal textures. And so we do the same thing with smaller scale textures, okay? And then we just let them all vote. I don't want to go into much detail here. Now, how did we do spatial attention? Well, you can have box textures around a texture. You can have pure textures which just pick out just the sky or just the water. You can have what we call shroud textures here, which would be like sky with a little bit of what's next to it, which would be what happened if you formed a shroud and then this got trapped by filling in. And this does the best. But, you know, they're all doing not so bad. So this is the best that we've seen in the literature up to that point. And this just shows you have evidence accumulation, you do better. Big deal. So the art scene summary is that this is all about global to local processing of textures supported by spatial attention shifts, and you can do it with fast incremental and stable category learning with no additional hypotheses. The kind of work we're trying to do now includes contextual cueing. In fact, I had a lovely conversation about contextual that included things like contextual cueing. So how do you try to bring together what you know about objects and textures into a better prediction? And we'll be publishing that soon. Well, I did that real fast, but the main point of that is shrouds really are useful in a lot of places where you might not have thought of it before. Okay. So here I just want to make a few points about decision making. I think I just, oh, good. That's why I have my backup here somewhere. Let's see. Oh, that's wrong. Oh. Whoops. It's somewhere. Let me see. That's what happened with you have too many things. Oh, did I just, it is in here. Aha. Okay. Is this live? There. So decision making, you know, is such a huge issue. I just want to make a couple of points. But first, what I want to note is that I've already slipped a lot of complementary processing into you. So across the what and where streams, I mentioned the 3D for motion model, claiming that form and motion cortical processes are complementary, and that a V2 to MT interaction gives you moving form and depth. I told you the ARTSCAN model, talking about recognition and tracking, to try to coordinate spatially invariant object category learning and spatially variant movement targets. Within the what cortical stream, I told you a little about the facade model and the complementarity of boundaries and surfaces, and the art model, the complementarity of attention and orienting systems. But now I just want to give you a pure where stream example in my last few minutes. And so this is work that I did with my student Praveen Pilly. It just came out in Vision Research. And the topic is temporal dynamics of decision making during motion perception visual cortex. And it's just about this V1 MTMST stream. And I'm telling you this because Bayesian processing has been used a lot now on brain. I think Bayes is really great stuff, but I'm not sure that it's adding much to our studies of brains. And so I want to throw down a sort of gauntlet to the Bayesians to do better than we do without them. Okay? So visual boundaries and visual motion are complementary. I told you this 3D for motion model. Now I just want to look at the motion model. Okay? One of the main things you might say, how the hell does he model these big systems? And the way is, there were so many databases, and they were all pressing from different directions on different combinations of stages until the pressure is absolutely unbearable, and you just don't have any wiggle room, and you're forced into thinking weird ideas like I've been telling you, you know. So what we do here, we can't just stay with this. We need to put on a decision or choice stage, and we very much simplify it for this database. I realize you have FEF and SEF and ACC and all these good regions, but we can explain these data that I'm looking at just with LIP and a little bit of basal ganglia gating. So first we have a representation of motion percept, then we have a movement choice, and I could tell you at another time what every stage is doing and all the data that supports each stage. But the main point is that Bayesian inference is really a popular approach to probabilistic decision making in the brain. And, you know, people seem to think that the probabilistic nature of perceptual decision making somehow implies that it must be Bayesian inference. To me, that seems just like a logical non sequitur. But the question is, does the hypothesis contribute any new perceptual principles in brain mechanisms? And the main worry is that the Bayes rule is so general that it applies to any phenomenon. You know, it's really a very general statistical tool. So the probability of A and B for any events A and B, you write it two different ways. You divide one side by the other, you optimize. A and B can be anything, clouds, quarks, you know, apples, flowers, brains. So you have to add something. And the question is, when you've added everything you need to add in terms of new design principles, are you really talking the Bayes game anymore? In our hands, the answer has been no, even though we feel we understand what the Bayesians are trying to say. Okay, so there are a number of issues. But the data in question are famous data due to Mike Shadlin and Bill Newsom and their colleagues. They have random dot motion input, so you just have lots of dots flashing. And they vary the dot coherence, so a fraction of the dots will move non-randomly, either to the right or to the left, and they vary the fraction. And all the coherent dots move in one direction on any trial, and they do these on monkeys. And they have behavioral data and they record from LIP. And the task of the monkey is to make a saccade to the target in the perceived direction. I don't have the stimuli here, and one reason I don't is that, you know, it tends to break down in different systems. But if you're interested, you can look on the web. And they have different tasks, a fixed duration task, a reaction time task. That isn't my main point today. My question is, what design principles explain these data? To me, that seems to be the main question you always want to ask. I claim that if you solve the global aperture problem and the noise saturation dilemma, then you can quantitatively simulate all the data. So I think many of you may know what the aperture problem is. You know, let's say I have a line that's moving horizontally across a circular aperture. It always looks like it's moving perpendicular to its orientation because you have this limited view. And this is the problem that every cell faces. It has a limited view. On the other hand, as Hans Wallach showed, let's say you have lines moving in any direction through a kind of rectangle like a barber pole, then under a wide variety of conditions, they always seem to move horizontal, i.e. parallel to the dominant orientation. And the idea is that everywhere inside here you have these aperture ambiguous signals. It can be going any which way. It's only at these edges that you have good directional signals. Problem is the edges are a set of measure zero in the image. So how does a set of measure zero capture the percept of everything seeming to go horizontally? Okay. So the question is, how do sparse feature tracking signals capture so many ambiguous signals to determine the perceived global motion direction? So most of the motion we see is this kind of illusion due to motion capture. And I can just briefly say to you, so first, you start with local directional signals. They're just transient bursts. Then you have evidence accumulation that amplifies those sparse feature tracking signals. Then you're going to have a kind of competition that's designed to strengthen that sparse set of feature tracking signals while down-regulating the ambiguous signals. You can think of it as a kind of real-time probability theory, but no one's ever going to say that. Then you're going to pool signals over multiple orientations, opposite contrast polarities, both eyes, multiple depths, and larger spatial scale. This is this MT thing, okay, and that's the reason why the prediction I had from V to the MT, because here you're giving up just what you need to get fine depth, but you're doing it to get good direction. And if you're thinking neurally, this is like a motion stream homologue of a complex cell in the form stream. And then you have this sort of grouping selection, which is going to determine a net object global motion, including solving the global aperture problem. So everything makes sense computationally. It's not just thrown in because someone told me there's another interneuron. Now, the second principle is noise saturation dilemma. And the problem is that small inputs could get lost in cellular noise, and large inputs could max out or saturate cell responses. And this is a problem that I proposed a solution to many a moon ago in the context of recurrent on-center, off-surround networks that obey shunting or cell membrane dynamics. That say it's just mass action laws. And the point is that I proved these networks self-normalize their cell activities. So they're like doing a real-time probability theory, and we've known it since the early 70s. And then you can get choice and noise suppression in these self-normalizing probabilistic networks if you have something like a sigmoid signal. And I call that a recurrent competitive field. And so the point is that here it was sufficient to assume that there's a recurrent competitive field in LIP that is transforming these distributed global object motion directions in MST into movement directions, left or right, in LIP under basal ganglia movement gating, okay, which I'll say nothing about. And I claim that's the end of the story. So let me just show you some simulations. I'm not going to try to explain it. I just explain it to you. Everything else is an emergent property, okay? So these are LIP responses during a task for the correct trials. These are the data. Here's the simulation. Here's during the reaction time task correct trials. Here's for the reaction time test during both correct and incorrect trials. Here's for the other task during both correct and incorrect trials. Here's the behavioral data with the same model in terms of accuracy, the data, the simulation. Here's the speed, the correct and error trials in the RT task, data simulation. Here you have not only where but also when you move the eyes. This is data simulation. So my point is that you really can quantitatively model the data, and I never said the word Bayes. But I did say there were two design principles, and no one in this literature other than us ever mentions them. And that worries me. Because why are we doing this? And the same mechanism has predicted a lot of other data. So here is how the model predicted that MT would go from the local motion to the captured motion direction. And this is data of my student, but then postdoc Chris Pack and Rick Bourne, showing that in MT. And there are many other data that we predicted that are all consistent with this model. So the weight of evidence is very strong. So that is Bayes the best game in town? I think the answer is no. But I'm saying this because I feel it's become a kind of cult, and I think that someone has to speak out against the cult. There are now biophysically detailed models of visual cortex that quantitatively simulate neurophysiologically recorded dynamics of identified cells in anatomically supported circuits and the behavioral data they generate. And these models embody new design principles, mechanisms, local circuits, global architectures that solve fundamental problems facing the brain. It is not just a probability formula. Okay? So, I've covered a lot of ground today. Thank you for your indulgence. The same model processes can explain many different types of data. And one of the goals is, as we fill in all the boxes, and in our center we do multiple projects that carve up these things, that gets us closer to getting a better understanding of this Van Essen diagram. And so, to me personally, it doesn't seem like such a mystery today, although there's still a huge amount of work to be done. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Steve, for the interesting lecture. I see now that you changed your rules. You used 4 colors in your presentation. When we used to work together, we had the rule that nobody could use more than 3 colors, green, red, and blue in the slides. Now you have magenta, so...
Well, you see, I've learned something over all these years.
And I have another point private later discussion, about use probability and in models. We actually...
I meant to be provocative here.
Okay, I know. Because actually under our project, we had a network. I mean, we used probabilities, normalization.
No, I'm not saying that the brain isn't good. I believe the brain is a superb statistical estimation device. And all I'm trying to remark in some of my comments is that the brain has discovered ways to do this in real time, in the far from stationary domain, without sweating it. And in fact, if you go into the lamina cortical circuits I couldn't tell you about today, they represent a really revolutionary way to compute. For example, they can go feed forward in a fast burst of processing if the data are unambiguous. And then they can just confirm through their feedback loops what it already knows, as it were. And if you know, like Simon Thorpe's work, you realize you can go very fast through the brain. On the other hand, let's say you have very ambiguous data, and so you have all these possibilities now. And due to the self-normalizing competition and how it's configured, everyone loses activity and coherence. And because of that, everybody slows down. And then the internal feedback loops close, and they start doing a kind of automatic hypothesis testing. They're all like little categories. And they suck in information, they suck in activity based on how much evidence they have. And so if they have much more evidence, they get much more active, and then they start shooting up faster. If they get less evidence, it takes longer. And what's a good example? How many of you know the Dalmatian in snow image? Just those spots. So on the one hand, the black spots on white paper, that can shoot right through. No one says it couldn't shoot right through. On the other hand, the emergent grouping of it into, the dog in the snow, that takes quite a while. That's sort of what I'm talking about. It goes as fast as it can, but then these internal things keep working and they can go slower. The second thing is it can be both analog and digital. Like talking to one of the great experts in analog VLSI, there are a lot of issues with noise in analog VLSI, and what the brain's discovered through its lamina cortical interactions is how to have the stability of digital with the sensitivity of analog. And that's huge. It's really huge, and it hasn't hardly been discussed. And then the third point is the difference between bottom-up data-driven processing and sort of top-down, higher-level knowledge. And in fact, I probably should just, the brain, I shouldn't keep talking about the brain, I should show you a circuit. Well, which circuit should I show you, maybe? I don't know. I forget what I have where. Sorry, I might be going in the wrong direction here. Maybe I have it here. No, whoops, I made a, okay. There are specific circuits at every cortical level that are an interface between bottom-up and top-down processing where you reach a kind of local consensus based on the amount of evidence. Let me see, where's that? And so it's doing all these things. It's analog and digital, it's bottom-up and top-down, and it's feed-forward and feedback all at once. It's not something, you don't have to give anything up. It's trying to understand these trade-offs.
So let me take a couple questions, Steve.
Yeah, for sure. So let me just say that that's going on in here, that interface. Okay, so that's very definite claim.
couple questions, and then I think we have to finish with you. Any questions? Hey, Jason.
So suppose I wanted to build a machine vision system using these principles. Of course, I'm looking not to predict human reaction times, but I'm looking to do tasks that the machine vision community would find interesting, for example, scene parsing. Let's just say Don Gehman likes to talk about identifying cats in the image, and maybe finding out their posture, or maybe you have something where you have a number of curved, maybe translucent surfaces, and you want to disentangle them. What would I be able to build today using this that would have, and how well would it do?
Well, maybe I should give two partial answers. So, over the years, for example, MIT Lincoln Lab, which is a big image processing house, has hired about 15 of our PhDs in order to use them for LiDAR, multispectral IR, night vision, blah, 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 recognition of targets in complex scenes and so on. We make most of our money that way. That's why we're funded, because our things do scale to large scenes. A second thing, so that's what we've been doing for about 25 years. And then they port it to a lot of other places that use it, for example, in defense. So both our image processing and our pattern recognition stuff is used in many large-scale systems. The second thing is that there's this new DARPA Synapse program whose aim is to try to develop sophisticated neuromorphic chips. And our group is on 2 out of 3 winners, so we're going to be working, started working with Hewlett-Packard and HRL Labs to do more of this in hardware. So we'll see. But that's how we make our living on large-scale applications.
Do you have an image anywhere of something which would serve as input to one of the Lincoln Lab systems and what the output
Well,
would be?
we usually get our images from Lincoln Lab, but I don't have it with me today.
Yeah, I mean, it's just hard for me to understand from the diagrams the extent to which or the way in which the principles work together to do visual processing that
right.
produces segmented output.
Well, this really wasn't a talk on vision.
Sure.
It was a talk where I had to say as little as I could get away with about vision to say things about how spatial attention works on view-invariant category learning. But, you know, if you just check my webpage, there are a ton of papers. We have a number of papers on SAR, and then there have been a number of papers from Lincoln using our stuff. So, I mean, yeah, I mean, this goes back into the 80s. You know, so, you know, I couldn't talk about everything today. If I got you interested, I accomplished my goal. So.
I had another question which might be more out of naivety than anything else. When you were describing earlier the shroud and how as you're changing, as you're scanning the object, you keep your object category alive because all these views are sort of supportive of that category, and at some point the view will be so different that it will catastrophically collapse and you'll start a new one. Now this seemed to have a sort of, at least the way you explained it, it necessarily had a sequential scanning mechanism underneath.
Not really, no.
I was going to ask you, so if I were to take
it happens sort of automatically. And let me just, so first, there are a number of technical issues that have to be done. So one is that a surface shroud resonance can't last forever. It's habituating as we go, so, you know, I might love your face, but I'm not going to look at it forever.
Otherwise, you're going to stuck there.
You get stuck there. But secondly, when you go to a target that's been defined by one of these contrast-enhanced surface contour locations, when you go there, there's inhibition of return. It actively shuts it down. So you have active inhibition of return and surface shroud habituation interacting with the log polar map. Remember, as you look at something, it's greatly expanded. And so it's that combination that keeps it looking. And I'm not saying this is over because, you know, I've worked on just eye movements for 30 years and I'm still working on them. And so here I'm just talking about one of the new control signals that would go into a rather complex brain system that involves a huge amount of brain tissue.
Steve, I mean, I also
but there's nothing built in serially here.
So I also had a follow-up on the shroud idea. Should we think of it as a lower dimensionality feature space?
Well, I mean, spatial
competence.
attention
Yes.
is really, that, think back to the original question, why don't I group all your features together as I learn your faces? You know, I mean, no one's saying your name or your name.
Right.
You know, first, at your distance, I might be happy with just a gist. But if you were closer, I'd be looking at your eyes,
But
your
in the
mouth.
shroud, I saw this object which was kind of like an oval, and I could say more like a head, and then there was something like a neck, and then I can now evidence accumulate to say, oh, that's the head of a person.
Well, what I haven't talked about, which remains a hard research problem, is that, you know, if you have a highly delineated thing like a face, you know, you're going to have a lot of boundary and surface components on multiple scales, and that's related to the 3D shape problem. And so you're having an interaction between a representation of 3D shape and the shrouds, and, you know, there's a huge amount of work to be done. But to me, it was just a huge liberation to be able to talk about this at all. I mean, for example, you know, like if you look at some of the MIT work, they just sort of assume everything is there, and you have weighted sums of translated Gaussians or something, and you can't get away with that for too long.
So I think with this we should probably finish our seminar. Thanks a lot, Peter, and then wrap it up because we have to